Chapter 1. Holes in the dawn of time long before medicine had names. Before the words surgery or therapy were invented, humanity already knew the sound of bone cracking under stone. It is one of the oldest acts of intervention known to archaeology. Trepanation, the deliberate cutting, scraping, or drilling of a hole into the human skull. Archaeologists have unearthed skulls bearing these strange openings from nearly every continent. The oldest examples date back over 7,000 years, some belonging to Neolithic farmers who lived and died long before the first cities were built. These skulls tell stories silently, round holes edged with careful cuts, sometimes half-healed, showing that the victim or patient survived the act. The remarkable detail is that this was not an isolated ritual. From the high plateaus of Peru to the green valleys of France, from North Africa to Polynesia, cultures separated by oceans all developed the same mysterious procedure. Why? The answer is as murky as it is haunting. Some anthropologists suggest that trepanation was an attempt to treat head trauma. In societies where violence was common, a blow to the head might fracture the skull or cause bleeding inside the brain. By scraping away bone, healers may have tried to relieve pressure. Others argue for spiritual motives, to let the demons out, to purge madness, seizures, or possession. For early humans, sickness was not a matter of biology, but of spirits, curses, and unseen forces pressing within. To open the head was to open a door, to release what should not be there. The tools were crude but effective. Flint blades, obsidian shards sharper than steel, deer antlers, and seashells all served as instruments. The process was slow. The practitioner would scrape layer after layer of bone until the white shell thinned, until finally a hole appeared. The brain itself, soft and pulsing beneath, was usually left intact. The patient endured without anesthesia, save perhaps herbs, alcohol, or chants meant to distract the spirit and dull the agony. Remarkably, many survived. Archaeologists can tell from bone regrowth that some lived months, years, even decades after their skulls were opened. In Peru, survival rates of ancient trepanation appear to exceed those of 19th century battlefield surgeons. This points to something shocking. Early humans, often dismissed as primitive, were capable of performing a dangerous cranial surgery with skill that modern observers struggle to explain, yet survival did not erase the aura of dread around the act. Imagine the scene, a firelit cave, the smell of blood mixing with smoke, chants echoing as a stone blade scrapes against living bone. The patient bound, trembling, while a healer, shaman, or surgeon leans close, coaxing an opening into the human head. In those moments, medicine, magic, and terror were indistinguishable. The hole in the skull was not merely a wound. It was a passage, a gateway between the human body and the realm of gods and spirits. We cannot know the words spoken or the prayers whispered, but the skulls remain. A child of 6 in the Loire Valley, his tiny head bored with a perfect circle. A warrior of the Andes, his cranium scarred by multiple trepanations, each one survived until death finally claimed him. A woman buried in Jericho, her skull scraped so carefully that she must have lived long after the ritual. Trepanation became, in some cultures, almost common. In pre-Columbian Peru, it was practiced so widely that some skulls bear 2, 3, even 4 trepanations. Were these patients repeatedly injured in war? Or was the act itself seen as strengthening, a way of aligning the mind with divine order? The answers remain buried with them. Still, not all were so fortunate. Many skulls show signs of infection, of incomplete cuts where the patient likely died mid-procedure. Others bear jagged holes, evidence of less careful hands. The line between healer and butcher must have been thin. To volunteer or be chosen, for trepanation was to gamble with life and death under the stone hand of another dot, and so trepanation emerged as a paradox, a procedure both healing and horrifying, both survival and sacrifice. It was the first great intrusion into the sanctity of the human body, the earliest attempt to manipulate the very seat of thought and self. When we gaze into those ancient holes, we are staring into the dawn of medicine itself, a dawn lit not with comfort and cure, but with fire, blood, and bone. The prehistoric age set the stage. The practice would not vanish. Instead, it would travel forward, reshaped by new civilizations. In Greece, trepanation would be reframed as a tool of rational medicine. In Rome, it would become a military necessity. In medieval Europe, it would darken into exorcism and punishment. Yet through all these transformations, the essence remained, the deliberate perforation of the human skull, the ancient belief that by opening the head, one could reach inside the mysteries of the mind. The first chapter of this story ends with the rise of civilization. Humanity had found ways to plant crops, build monuments, and raise armies. But just as surely, it carried forward its oldest and strangest surgery. The stone blade gave way to the bronze chisel, the iron drill, and later the surgeon's trepan. The settings shifted from caves to temples, from huts to hospitals, but the ritual endured, the hole in the skull remained, a silent witness to fear, faith, and the desperate search for healing. Chapter 2. The Rational Blade. Greece and Rome by the timestone tools gave way to bronze and iron. Humanity had not abandoned trepanation. On the contrary, the practice endured and, in some corners of the world, flourished. The growing civilizations of the Mediterranean began to view the skull not as a vessel to be purified of demons, but as a battlefield of humors, injuries, and imbalance. Yet the hole in the head remained, transformed perhaps, but never tamed. The Greeks were among the first to record trepanation in writing. Hippocrates, the physician whose name still defines the ethical oath of doctors, devoted entire sections of his corpus to the operation. To him, trepanation was not sorcery but surgery. He prescribed it for fractures, contusions, and depressions of the skull caused by blunt force. Soldiers struck in combat, laborers crushed under falling stones, farmers injured by plows. These were his patients. Trepanation, Hippocrates advised, could relieve the pressure of trapped blood, preventing the creeping death of infection and swelling, yet his instructions read less like calm guidance and more like a ritual of controlled violence. He warned not to penetrate too deep, lest the dura, the membrane over the brain, be injured. He described the rasping wheel of the trepan, a bronze or iron tool turned by hand, scraping the skull down layer by layer. The smell of burning bone often filled the air, for Greek surgeons heated the metal instrument so that friction would cauterize as it cut. The patient, fully conscious, would feel both the grinding and the heat, an agony beyond imagination. Pain, in that age, was simply a part of medicine. The Greek belief in balance governed the act. Disease, Hippocrates argued, came from the imbalance of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A blow to the head created chaos within. Trepanation allowed the physician to drain corrupted blood, to let excess fluids escape, to restore harmony. In this sense, the procedure was both physical and philosophical. It was not the banishment of demons, but the regulation of the body's inner order. And yet, for all its supposed rationality, trepanation never escaped its aura of dread. In Greek plays and stories, the head remained sacred, the seat of reason, the temple of the soul. To cut into it was to dance on the edge of hubris, to trespass against nature. Patients submitted because death was worse, but the horror lingered. Even Hippocrates himself cautioned against overuse, urging his followers to trepan only when absolutely necessary. Perhaps even he sensed the shadow that clung to the practice. The Romans inherited Greek medicine as they inherited Greek gods, philosophy, and art, but Rome was a harsher world, one of relentless war. In its legions, trepanation became less a philosophical matter and more a brutal necessity. Roman surgeons, stationed on battlefields littered with shattered skulls, had no time for rituals of balance. They cut because soldiers would die without it. Fractured crania, embedded arrowheads, splintered bone, all demanded swift intervention. The Roman trepan was a vicious tool, an iron drill with sharp teeth, sometimes fitted with a crossbar to give leverage. It could bore into the skull like a carpenter's auger. Writers like Celsus and Galen, who documented surgical techniques, described the operation in graphic detail. The patient, pinned or held down, would hear the crunching of his own skull as the drill bit deeper. Some surgeons recommended stopping periodically to pour in vinegar or wine, cleansing the wound, dulling infection with the sting of alcohol. Others suggested placing sponges soaked in narcotic herbs under the nose, but these were weak comforts at best. Most endured the operation awake, their cries muffled by leather straps between their teeth, Roman pragmatism treated the skull not as a mystical doorway but as damaged armor. The surgeon was an engineer of flesh, repairing the broken helmet of bone. Success meant returning a soldier to the ranks, failure meant a body on the pyre. The battlefield thus made trepanation more frequent, more standardized, and perhaps in some cases, more skilled. Yet outside the camps and forums, the old beliefs never fully died. Ordinary Romans, steeped in superstition, still saw madness and epilepsy as the work of spirits. Some submitted to trepanation in the hope that an opening in the skull might free them. Others sought amulets carved from fragments of bone removed during surgery. Grisly charms believed to protect against headaches or possession. Even as Galen wrote treatises on anatomy, the people clung to rituals older than Rome itself. In both Greece and Rome, trepanation straddled a line. It was science and superstition, necessity and nightmare. It was taught in academies and practiced in temples, wielded by physicians and village healers alike. The surgeon's hand might be guided by reason, but the patient's terror was the same as that of his Neolithic ancestor under the stone knife. The practice also left behind a legacy of instruments. Archaeologists have uncovered trepans in graves and ruins, bronze wheels with serrated edges, iron drills worn smooth by use, even cases of surgical tools buried with their owners. These artifacts remind us that trepanation was not a marginal curiosity, but a recognized part of ancient medicine. It sat alongside bloodletting, cauterization, and amputation as one of the accepted methods of intervention, but acceptance did not mean safety. Many patients died from shock, from infection, from the crude imprecision of the instruments. Survival was a gamble, and the odds, though sometimes better than we expect, were far from comforting. Still, the fact that so many did survive testifies to the skill of these early surgeons, who, with no knowledge of microbes or anesthesia, managed feats that still astonish. The Roman Empire eventually crumbled, its legions scattered, its libraries burned, its physicians dispersed, but the knowledge of trepanation did not vanish. Carried forward by fragments of text, by wandering healers, by the stubborn continuity of tradition, the practice entered the long night of the Middle Ages. There, it would take on darker meanings once more, infused with demons, exorcisms, and the harsh hand of superstition reborn. For now, though, in the bright marble halls of Greece and the blood-stained camps of Rome, trepanation had become something both ordinary and extraordinary. It was a bridge between two worlds, the rational and the irrational, the healing and the horrific. A hole carved in bone, at once a remedy and a reminder that the human head, the crown of flesh, could be pierced, violated, and reshaped in the name of survival. Chapter 3: Demons, Exorcisms, and Renaissance Blades. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the bright sheen of classical medicine dimmed. The Middle Ages, often painted as an age of superstition and darkness, did not extinguish trepanation, it twisted it. What had been the calculated tool of Hippocrates and Galen became once more a weapon against demons, madness, and sin. The hole in the skull, in this era, was not only a medical intervention, but a battlefield of faith. Medieval Europe viewed disease through a spiritual lens. A man who suffered seizures was thought to be cursed or possessed. A woman who heard voices might be called a witch. Madness was often attributed to an infestation of evil spirits. And trepanation, the act of opening the head, seemed to offer both symbolic and physical release. To bore a hole in the skull was to carve a passage for the devil to flee. Monks recorded cases of cures in which patients were drilled to let out the unholy presence. Unsurprisingly, the survival rate plummeted. The procedure was rarely performed by trained surgeons. Often it was carried out by barbers, monks, or village healers with little more than knives-alls. And prayer. The imagery of demons fleeing through skull holes bled into folklore. Woodcuts and manuscripts show grotesque scenes, physicians prying open heads while tiny imps tumble out, squealing as they are expelled. Patients are shown wide-eyed, their agony transformed into moral theater. To undergo trepanation was not simply to risk one's life, but to make one's body a stage upon which God's power might be displayed. Yet trepanation also had a more pragmatic, sighed in the Middle Ages, wars raged constantly, the Crusades, feudal conflicts, border skirmishes. Head wounds were common, and even the most devout healer could not ignore shattered skulls. Battlefield surgeons carried crude trepans, often little more than hand drills fitted with circular blades. They used them to lift splinters of bone from soldiers' heads, to relieve pressure, to save lives. In this sense, the practice preserved its continuity as a surgical necessity. Some manuals of surgery from the 13th and 14th centuries, such as those by Henry de Mondeville or Guy de Chauliac, carefully illustrated the procedure. Their writings blended superstition with technical detail, advising when to cut, how to hold the drill, and even how to shape bandages afterwards. Still, infection was the ever-present enemy. Without understanding bacteria, medieval surgeons relied on wine, vinegar, or honey to cleanse wounds. Sometimes these helped. Often they failed. Many patients succumbed not to the hole itself, but to the fever that followed. The skull might knit, but the body wasted. Trepanation was, in truth, a gamble, one played at the razor's edge of ignorance. The Renaissance brought with it a revival of learning. Ancient texts were rediscovered, and with them, the rational methods of Hippocrates and Galen, surgeons like Ambroise. Père in the 16th century elevated trepanation from superstition back into the realm of surgical science. Père, who treated countless battlefield wounds, described trepanation in meticulous detail. He even invented improved instruments, such as crown saws with guards to prevent plunging too deep. His concern was not demons, but damaged bone, depressed fractures, and the accumulation of extravasated blood pressing upon the brain. The Renaissance also birthed a fascination with anatomy. Dissections, once forbidden, became spectacles of knowledge. Surgeons examined the skull and brain with a new hunger for understanding. Trepanation was now not merely a cure, but a window into the body's greatest mystery, the mind. Physicians speculated that by opening the skull, one could study thought itself, glimpse the machinery of the soul. The practice thus straddled medicine and philosophy, its shadows deepened by the very light of inquiry, and yet the old beliefs never fully died. In village squares, charlatans continued to promise the removal of stones of madness, small pebbles or bits of bone supposedly lodged in the head, responsible for lunacy or melancholy. They staged theatrical operations, pressing crude blades into the scalp and producing a hidden stone as proof of success. Paintings from the Dutch Golden Age, such as Hieronymus Bosch's The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, satirized these fraudulent healers. But they also testified to the persistence of the idea that trepanation could release madness itself, by the late Renaissance. Trepanation had thus become a procedure of dual identity. In universities and battlefields, it was a serious, dangerous, and sometimes life-saving surgery. In marketplaces and village fairs, it was a performance, a grotesque show meant to exploit fear. Between these extremes, thousands of skulls were opened, some healed. Many did not. The Renaissance also expanded trepanation beyond Europe. Explorers returning from the New World encountered Incan skulls bearing clean, multiple trepanations with astonishing survival rates. These discoveries shocked European physicians who realized that indigenous surgeons often had higher success than their own. In Peru, survival rates may have exceeded 70%, a figure unimaginable in Europe. This forced some physicians to re-examine their techniques, though few could admit that savages might outmatch them in surgical skill. Thus, as the Renaissance closed and the Age of Enlightenment dawned, trepanation stood at a crossroads. It was no longer the exclusive province of superstition, nor fully embraced as science. It lingered between spectacle and surgery, exorcism and anatomy, miracle and medicine. The hole in the skull remained a portal, sometimes to healing, sometimes to death, always to mystery. The medieval and Renaissance centuries did not soften the brutality of trepanation. If anything, they heightened its contradictions. For the patient bound in the surgeon's chair, staring up at the whirling crown saw, there was little difference between demon-banishing ritual and battlefield repair. Pain, blood, and fear were constants. What changed was the meaning imposed upon the act, sin expelled, bone repaired, madness relieved, knowledge gained. The story was far from finished. With the Enlightenment and the rise of modern science, trepanation would face new interpretations, new instruments, and new controversies. It would evolve from a desperate cut of survival into a subject of debate, obsession, and, in some strange corners, revival. Chapter 4. Enlightenment Shadows and Modern Echoes. The Age of Enlightenment promised reason, science, and the banishment of superstition. In the laboratories of Europe, men in powdered wigs dissected cadavers under candlelight, mapping the organs, sketching the skeleton, measuring the skull. Trepanation, once wrapped in chants and charms, now wore the sober mask of anatomy. But even as medicine advanced, the old ritual persisted, hovering like a ghost behind the surgeon's hand. 18th century surgeons carried trepans of brass and steel, polished instruments kept in velvet-lined cases. They resembled the tools of carpenters and watchmakers, crown saws, rasping drills, perforators with guards to prevent plunging too far. The patient, however, faced much the same ordeal as his medieval ancestor. Anesthesia was crude or absent. Alcohol, opium tinctures, or a cloth soaked in laudanum might dull the senses, but the whir of the trepan still bored into the living skull. The Enlightenment surgeon worked by lamplight, surrounded by assistants holding down the writhing body. As bone dust mixed with blood on the floor, the rationale for trepanation grew more precise. Physicians recommended it for depressed skull fractures, for bleeding within the cranial vault, sometimes even for persistent headaches or mania. The doctrine of humors faded, replaced by the emerging science of pathology, yet the head remained a mysterious frontier. Some surgeons believed that opening the skull could relieve congestion of the brain, a vague term covering everything from strokes to psychosis. The operation was dangerous, but the alternative, death or madness, was often worse. The 19th century, with its revolutions in science, transformed trepanation. Two discoveries reshaped surgery, anesthesia and antisepsis. In 1846, the first public demonstration of ether anesthesia stunned the medical world. Suddenly, operations once defined by screams and thrashing could be performed in silence. Patients slipped into unconsciousness, and for the first time, surgeons could cut without the chaos of pain. A few decades later, Joseph Lister introduced carbolic acid sprays, championing the germ theory of disease. Infection, the silent killer of trepanation, could finally be fought. Together, these breakthroughs elevated cranial surgery from a desperate gamble to a disciplined art. In Victorian hospitals, trepanation became part of the emerging field of neurosurgery. Surgeons in white coats and blood-stiffened aprons drilled into skulls with newfound confidence. They removed clots, elevated fractures, and even attempted to excise tumors pressing on the brain. The operating theater, once a chamber of horror, became a stage of progress. Audiences of students watched from galleries as professors demonstrated the new surgery of the brain. The mortality rate remained high, but survival was no longer miraculous. It was expected, and yet the old shadows lingered. The very act of opening the head carried symbolic weight. Victorian newspapers reported such operations with a mixture of awe and dread. To readers, the idea of a surgeon tampering with the seat of thought bordered on the unnatural. Some called these men pioneers. Others whispered of hubris of playing God. The patient who emerged healed was hailed as a wonder. The one who died was a cautionary tale. By the early 20th century, trepanation had evolved into modern craniotomy. The word changed, but the essence was the same, cutting through skull to reach the brain. Neurologists like Harvey Cushing refined techniques, introducing meticulous methods to control bleeding and reduce shock. What had begun as scraping with stone blades became a specialized branch of medicine neurosurgery, one of the most respected yet daunting of disciplines. Trepanation, stripped of its ritual, had become science at last, but history is rarely so clean. Even as hospitals embraced sterile scalpels, a curious countercurrent stirred. In the 1960s and 70s, amid the cultural revolutions of the West, a handful of eccentric thinkers resurrected trepanation as a path to higher consciousness. Dutch medical student Bart Hughes argued that drilling a hole in the skull could restore the pulsation of blood in the brain, enhancing awareness and creativity. Followers, some armed with household drills, performed the act upon themselves, claiming visions and expanded minds. Photographs of smiling men and women with bandaged heads circulated in underground communities, half shocking, half absurd. The ancient ritual had returned, not as medicine but as countercultural experiment. These modern revivalists stood outside the medical establishment, dismissed as cranks or dangers to themselves. Yet their existence proved something unsettling. The idea of trepanation never fully died. Across millennia, across continents, across empires, the human urge to open the head persisted. Sometimes it was for survival, sometimes for exorcism, sometimes for enlightenment. The hole in the skull was never just bone removed. It was always a doorway, literal and symbolic, into realms beyond ordinary reach. Today, neurosurgeons wield diamond-tipped drills in sterile theaters. They map brain function with electrodes, navigate with imaging, cut with precision unthinkable to Hippocrates or Pear. The patients lie asleep, their pain banished, their odds of survival vastly improved. Trepanation, in its modern guise, saves lives daily. A car accident victim with swelling on the brain, a child with a tumor, a soldier with shrapnel, all may live because a surgeon dares to pierce the skull, and yet, when one looks back, from the clean light of a modern hospital to the firelit cave of prehistory, the continuity is haunting. The act is the same, to open the human head, to trespass into the sanctuary of thought. It began as magic, became medicine, and still carries the echo of both. The fear, the awe, the trembling hands, these remain unchanged. Trepanation's history is not merely medical. It is a mirror of humanity itself. Our desperation to heal, our terror of death, our hunger for knowledge, our flirtation with the forbiddance. To carve a hole in the skull is to declare war against suffering, but also to admit how fragile we are. Each perforated skull in a museum case, each scarred patient in a hospital bed, tells the same story. That survival and meaning are often born in blood and risk. The 4 chapters of Trepanation's history trace a circle. Prehistoric shamans scraped away bone to let spirits out. Greek physicians rationalized the act as restoring balance. Medieval priests and charlatans turned it into exorcism and spectacle. Renaissance and Enlightenment surgeons reclaimed it as science. Victorians elevated it into neurosurgery. And modern eccentrics, in defiance of reason, revived it as a path to transcendence. Always the same gesture, always the same audacity. To open what should remain closed. What then is trepanation? A cure? A ritual? A delusion? Perhaps it is all of these. Perhaps it is simply the oldest symbol of humanity's refusal to accept limits. We are creatures who cut into our own heads in search of healing, truth, or eternity. The hole in the skull, whether filled by bone regrowth or preserved in silence, remains an eternal wound, one that speaks across the ages. The story ends, but the circle does not. Somewhere, tonight, in a hospital, a surgeon bends over a shaved scalp, the whir of a drill echoing in sterile air. Somewhere else, a believer whispers that a hole in the head might free the mind. In both acts lies the shadow of the same ancient fire, the same scraping of stone on bone, the same trembling hope that through this terrible passage, life might be restored or something greater might be found.